I worked as a night nurse at a large hospital in upstate New York for almost 5 years. Most nights were routine: med rounds, paperwork, the occasional emergency. But there was one floor, the old 7th, that everyone tried to avoid. It was supposed to be closed for renovations, but sometimes, when the hospital was full, they'd open a few rooms for overflow patients. The lights were dim, the paint was peeling, and the whole place smelled like old disinfectant and dust. One night I was assigned to cover a patient on 7. The rest of my patients were on 5, so I wasn't happy about it. But I didn't have a choice. The elevator creaked as I rode up, and when the doors opened, the hallway was almost completely dark. Only a few emergency lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows on the linoleum. My patient was an older man recovering from surgery. He was asleep when I checked on him, so I quietly took his vitals and made a note in his chart. As I was leaving, I heard footsteps coming from the far end of the hall. I figured it was another nurse or maybe security, but when I looked, the hallway was empty. I shrugged it off and headed back toward the elevator. As I passed one of the empty rooms, I heard a voice, soft, almost a whisper, "Help me." I stopped, heart pounding, and peeked inside. The room was dark, the bed empty, but I could see the outline of someone standing by the window. I turned on the light, but the room was empty. No one by the window, no footprints on the dusty floor. I felt a chill run down my spine. I turned off the light and hurried back to the elevator, telling myself it was just my imagination. Back at the nurse's station, I tried to focus on my paperwork, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Around 3 a.m., the call light for the room I'd just checked flickered on. I went back up, expecting to find my patient awake, but he was still asleep, breathing steadily. The call button was on the floor, nowhere near his hand. As I bent down to pick it up, I heard the whisper again, right behind me. "Help me." I spun around, but the room was empty. The air felt heavy, almost electric. I backed out of the room and nearly ran down the hall. The next morning, I told one of the older nurses what happened. She just nodded and said, "You heard her, didn't you?" She told me that years ago, a young woman had died in that room, alone, after a long illness. Some nurses said she still wandered the halls, looking for someone to help her. I never volunteered for the 7th floor again. Even now, years later, I still get chills when I think about that whisper, and the feeling of being watched by something I couldn't see. My uncle was an ER doctor in a mid-sized city in Ohio for most of his career. He's the most rational, no-nonsense person I know, but there's one story he told me that still makes my skin crawl. It was a slow night in the ER, just after 2 a.m. The waiting room was empty except for a young woman with a sprained ankle and an older man in a faded suit, sitting quietly in the corner. The man hadn't checked in, hadn't spoken to anyone, just sat there with his hands folded in his lap staring at the floor. My uncle noticed him after a while and asked the triage nurse if she'd spoken to him. She shook her head. She thought he was waiting for someone. My uncle walked over and asked if he needed help. The man looked up and my uncle said his eyes were the most tired, haunted eyes he'd ever seen. "I'm just waiting for my wife," the man said, voice barely above a whisper. "She's coming soon." My uncle nodded and went back to his rounds. An hour passed, and the man didn't move. The young woman was discharged and the waiting room was empty except for him. The security guard came by and asked if he needed a ride home, but the man just repeated, "I'm waiting for my wife." Around 4 a.m., a code blue was called for a woman in her 70s who'd been brought in after a heart attack. Despite their best efforts, she passed away. My uncle was filling out paperwork when he remembered the man in the waiting room. He went back out, but the man was gone. The security guard swore he never saw him leave. Later, as my uncle was reviewing the deceased woman's chart, he saw her emergency contact listed, a husband, same name as the man in the waiting room. But when he checked the records, he found something that made his blood run cold. The husband had died 2 years earlier, in the same hospital, after a long illness. My uncle doesn't believe in ghosts, but he can't explain what happened that night. He says sometimes when the ER is quiet and the waiting room is empty, he'll catch a glimpse of a man in a faded suit, sitting in the corner, waiting for someone who will never come. My first job out of college was as a night security guard at a big hospital in Texas. The pay was decent, and the hours were quiet, but the building itself always felt off to me, like it was holding secrets in its walls. The hospital had been expanded and renovated so many times that some of the old wings were barely used, and the staff joked about getting lost in the maze of empty corridors. One of my main duties was to do rounds every hour, checking doors and making sure no one was wandering where they shouldn't be. The worst part was the old service elevator at the back of the building. It was slow, creaky, and barely big enough for a stretcher. Most of the time it was locked on the basement level, but sometimes, for no reason, it would show up on a different floor, doors open, lights flickering. One night, around 2:30 a.m., I was doing my rounds when I heard the elevator bell ding on the 3rd floor. That wing was supposed to be empty. No patients, no staff, just storage rooms and old equipment. I walked over expecting to find a maintenance worker, or maybe a nurse taking a shortcut. But when I got there, the elevator doors were open, and the car was empty. I stepped inside, intending to send it back to the basement, but as soon as I pressed the button, the doors slid shut and the elevator started moving, except none of the floor lights lit up. The car just rattled and shook, going up and down, stopping at random floors. Every time the doors opened, I saw nothing but dark, empty hallways. After what felt like forever, the elevator stopped on the 5th floor. The doors opened, and I saw a woman standing at the end of the hallway, wearing a hospital gown, her hair long and tangled. She was barefoot and her skin looked almost gray in the fluorescent light. She didn't move, just stared at me with wide, empty eyes. I called out, asking if she needed help, but she didn't answer. I stepped out of the elevator, and as soon as I did, the doors slammed shut behind me. I turned back, but the elevator was gone. No lights, no sound, just the echo of my own footsteps. The woman started walking toward me, slow and unsteady. I backed away, heart pounding, but she kept coming, her eyes never leaving mine. I turned and ran down the hallway, trying every door, but they were all locked. I could hear her footsteps behind me, dragging on the tile. Finally, I found a stairwell and bolted down the stairs, not stopping until I reached the main lobby. I told the charge nurse what happened, but she just shook her head. "You saw her, didn't you?" she said. "The elevator ghost." She told me that years ago, a patient had gone missing from her room. They found her days later, dead in the old service elevator, after wandering the hospital in a confused state. Since then, staff and patients had reported seeing her on the upper floors, always at night, always near the elevator. I never used that elevator again. I finished out my contract and found another job, but sometimes when I'm alone in a building late at night, I hear the ding of an elevator bell and remember the look in that woman's eyes, lost, desperate, and forever searching for a way out.